Good afternoon, everybody. The year is 2024, and it's a time of great reflection for a lot of people. A lot of people these days are complaining about a lot of things. A lot of people say that the cost of living is very high. A lot of people say that things, in terms of the culture, was just better in the past. Well, let's take a little ride today. You guys can come along, and we'll speak about this, because I don't think all is as it may initially seem. Come on, let's go. So there seems to be a big idea in a lot of people's head that today and the modern day and age is just not where it's at. That things were better in the bygone eras, the long gone past. And this is an idea that I think facilitates a lot of people's belief that, modern life is just not that good, especially compared to the past. Now we'll think about a few of the things that leads people to believe this, and a few of the reference points that people often focus on. So a big thing that a lot of people tend to focus on is the monetary and economic systems. Now obviously this one's a little bit more comprehensive because it depends very much on which country you're in, and certain economies in the past, 100 years, have risen whilst others have fallen. Now let's take that out of the equation and focus on the specific and the individual, right? There's this common notion that working conditions were better back in the day. The idea that the average man could work, have a wife at home, 2 kids, holiday and a couple of cars. And whilst it seems like there is an element of truth to this, and whilst in a lot of ways it seems that some workers had better rights and conditions, this wasn't the case for everybody. A lot of these jobs are jobs that modern people just would not want to do. They had long hours, they were very difficult physically and mentally, and also, a lot of high-paying jobs would have required degrees, which would have been, in some ways, harder to get. A lot of the houses that people were buying were not necessarily of the best quality. Do bear in mind that, in the UK at least, it was not always custom for houses to have, functional baths and bathrooms, including toilets. Now, it depends how far back in history we go, and we could make an argument that in some ways, maybe the 70s or 80s, or even earlier than that was, in some ways, better conditions, but let's not get it confused, right? Some of these times were times of great economic instability, challenge, and division. And whilst that is the same as what we're seeing right now, look at it, look at the way things are. Everybody in theory can go to university, can get a good job, and if they're willing to work very, very hard, admittedly, they can still make something of themselves. Now, is that a challenge? Absolutely it is. But it's another way that people may mistake the past as being better. People were often willing to work more and harder in the early stages of their life to have a prosperous career later down the line. Now, I would definitely make an argument that it's not the case that the modern day is entirely better in everything. For instance, look at things in certain countries, like the UK for example, some of the issues that we're seeing specifically related to the modern day, right? Things like crime, which is, very high. Things like social cohesion, which do appear to be, in some ways, getting worse. Litter on the streets and the like. Let's not act like it is in all ways the best, but in a lot of ways, we are living in the most prosperous and fruitful time in human history. I mean, it depends how far back we want to go. Some people say the 80s was the best time to be alive. Some people say it was the 50s. Some might say it was even before that. But in reality, if we go back before the 1950s, things like indoor heating in certain countries may not have been as custom. As for quality of life and longevity of life, it may not have been as good. Now, like I say, in the efforts of trying to make a fair and balanced argument, some things back then were undeniably better. The statistics prove that houses, as a relation of wages, seem to be substantially lower in a lot of countries, and also social mobility was higher, meaning that you could, in theory, make more of your life through your career. With that being said, we've now got the internet, which makes it easier for people to make more than they ever could have in the past, in easier ways as well. Now, I don't have every statistic, but I'll say one thing. It's undeniable that there were things about the past that were better, and there was things about the past that were worse. The trouble is, people don't like to acknowledge the fact that certain things were not as good, like so bad that you wouldn't even want to live then. And I'm sure this is one of those videos where if it does semi-well, we're going to have people in the comment section of either side. We're going to have people saying, well, the 50s or the 70s was better for this reason, and it was a better time to be alive. Then we'll have people who was alive in that time saying why it was worse and why young people today have it so easy. The point that I'm trying to make here is this. We can focus on the fact that the 50s, the 90s, the 2000s was the best time, the worst time. Every time's had its trouble. Every time has had its trouble. The time that you think is the best, there were some issues of that. And I like to make this reference, right? There's stuff that people born or even living in the 50s, 60s, even the 70s or 80s that we have, they couldn't have imagined of. They could not have imagined that that would exist. Think about things like the mobile phone and the way it works, right? The smartphone, not necessarily the mobile phone. You can do everything on the device that you probably have in your hands right now. Think about all that you can learn, right? So we talk about the olden times being the best times, not necessarily. Things as simple as a hot bath that we take for granted are things that people throughout the most of history would have really probably killed for. I mean, just think about this. If you're living in somewhere like Europe, the US, the UK, whatever, Australia, you're probably living now better, even if you're in the bottom half of earners, incomes, households. You're probably living in a lot of ways better than kings and queens of the past could have. Think about it, the easy access that you have to things like, again, hot water, medical health and treatments, foods from around the world, culture from around the world, spices, sugar, things that were really valuable trades back in the day that you can now go to Tesco's and pick them up for like, what, £2? Now, there is a point to this. There really is. And I think I need to focus on why people like to make the past seem better. Now, there's two perspectives on this, I believe. I think the first one is going to be old people. And I think the reason why they do it is mainly the whole concept of survivorship bias. So, for instance, let's say I was born in the 50s, I followed the path that worked back in that day, and now I look back at what people are doing now, or I look forward to what people are doing now, and it seems like they're directionless, right? So I might say that things seem better in the past because that's the time that I was alive, it's the time that I did well, irrespective of the fact that other people may not have been. It may seem like that was the heyday for me, so it was a heyday for society. Then we have the other perspective, the younger people who weren't alive in that time. They look at the fact that people in that time were able to buy houses and live certain lifestyles, and they think that means it was better. Now, here's a great point of privilege. The fact that a lot of young people now have the ability to not work full-time, have the ability to choose what career they go into, do a degree, have 3 years as a gap year, or a couple of gap years. The fact that incomes are strong enough that you can live with your parents and they can support you. Yeah, I'm not saying that everything's perfect, obviously it's not. Some of these things are worse, and there is going to be people who genuinely can't have the lifestyle that they want. But at the same time, here's my point. Looking back to the past, what it does is it means that we don't focus so much on the current, and the current is this. We have so much stuff now that people would have died for, people would have killed for. This is the truth. And I'm not saying that things are at the best that they've ever been. Some things are, I think, going downhill, and I don't want to focus necessarily on what they are, because we always have people in the comment section saying why it's not true. There are things that seem to be going downhill. Look at concepts like the cost of living crisis, the rent crisis, the housing crisis, the issues that we're seeing politically, right? All of these different things are valid issues of our time. But we say that we want to go back to the good old days. Well, think about it. We're living in them. We're living in them. The fact that you can't afford a house and a car and 3 kids, yes, it may have been a lot more potentially doable in the past, but that's only in the last 50 to 100 years. Go back further than that and the idea of the family was different, right? Go back further than that and we had, yes, lords and ladies, and people like to look at shows like Downton Abbey or Bridgerton and say, well, life in the Victorian days was great. Yeah, it was if you were a king or a queen or some level of nobility or whatever you'd call it. If you were a you or a me, it wasn't a good time, right? Obviously not. So here's my point. When you're making these points of saying that the 2020s or the 2030s is going to be the worst time to live in, we are going to face some issues that history's never seen. Obviously we are. We're currently facing some issues that history's never seen. some issues that are worse than ever before. But as a whole, life and quality of life is pretty good.